I am joined by Paul Everitt, one of my oldest friends in the Python community. I am so excited you have joined us this week for Python Web Conference. It is going to be a great show. You are talking to us today about one of the things that is near and dear to my heart, which is Markdown. Well, and Sphinx in Python, but Markdown. So I will let you take the show away.
So you want to do a static website. Let me get over here. And I'm going to make a static website, and it's my blog, Paul's blog. Welcome to Paul Land, all that normal stuff. And, it's a blog, so I'm going to do Python because I'm a Python person. And I'm going to do Markdown because the gods have spoken, and you can't do a static website without Markdown. And it's Markdown, so headings are easy, and paragraphs and lists are easy. And, it's Markdown, so images are easy. All you got to do is put an exclamation mark in front. I'm going to make a reference to a remote heading using a role, and I'm going to insert a top tree table of contents. And then here's how it looks full screen. And wait a second. You said Markdown. That's not Markdown. That's Sphinx. But it's also Markdown. Hi, I'm Paul Everitt, JetBrains developer advocate. I'm the luckiest duck of all the lucky duckies. I get to work with PyCharm and WebStorm and JetBrains. I really should be paying them my salary. Don't tell them I said that. And today we are going to talk about Sphinx and Markdown using the revelation known as the MyST parser. You don't have to make the choice anymore. This talk is for people who love Sphinx, like me. People who know a little bit about Sphinx are interested, but you're like, no way, man. Restructured text. Ain't nobody doing restructured text. This is also aimed at people who don't really know a lot about Sphinx, aren't in love with it like I am, and might ask the question of, is it like Jekyll? Narrator, it's a lot more than Jekyll. So we're going to cover a little treatment of setup. How do I get Sphinx if you don't know what Sphinx is? But most importantly, how do I add that little magic known as Markdown in MyST? We're going to do a little bit of simple Markdown to kind of prove that if you just know the Markdown basics, but you still want to use Sphinx, you can. We're going to get into a little bit of the cooler stuff about it's Markdown, but it's Sphinx. We're going to get into my favorite part, which is linking and the information base. Yeah, sorry, Slack is not obeying my do not disturb. I'm going to leave it on anyway so that I can look down. I know where the bodies are buried, Calvin, because I buried them. We're going to do some code snippets. Again, one of those things that really brings out the power of Sphinx. And then I'm going to get into some advanced constructs that MyST enables. As a famous philosopher named Jim Fulton said, hold on to your butts. I'm going to do 73 slides. I'm going to go kind of fast. Sorry, not sorry. But you don't have to worry about it. This is a Paul Everitt presentation. I'm here to entertain you, not educate you. Everything I'm going to show available online. Sit back, listen, enjoy, open your mind up, walk away excited about Markdown and Sphinx. Let's get started with the setup part. I got to set up Sphinx. There's a website, explains it pretty well. It's what you think it would be. Pip install Sphinx. But then after that, you can run a scaffold to generate a sample site for you. Answer a bunch of questions. Sure, I'd like a makefile for Windows. After that, you have a working Sphinx site. Now, I'm going to put a little surprise in. There's this package called Live Reload, and Guy was talking in the channel about coming from the JavaScript world, and I've been spending a lot of time in the front-end world. And my goodness, they got the tooling down pat with these Live Reload servers. Do a little typing, you save. In the case of JavaScript, 400,000 NPM packages do their work, regenerate all your universe, and tell the browser to reload. You're just typing, looking over, typing, looking over. Live Reload lets you get that. It's also simple, pip install. And then you write a little script that you want to run. Like here, I'm saying, hey, Live Reload, watch these things. And when they change, run this command. Not that hard. It has a couple of sharp edges, but it's good enough for me to use and make me feel really productive. Dun, dun, dun. The star of the show, MyST. This is the addition that lets you use Markdown in Sphinx. And it's funny for me to say that because I've spent a lot of time in the last couple of weeks working on all this stuff. And just saying it adds Markdown to Sphinx. Oh, baby, it does a lot more than that. So in a nutshell, architecturally, MyST and the layer below it, Markdown-IT-Pi, it's a parser for Sphinx with some cool things. It's a parser for Markdown in Python with some cool extensibility features. And then MyST takes that and generates doc trees for docutils. Little known fact, restructured text and docutils doesn't have to look that way. It has an abstract parser. You can plug any old grammar into it that you want. Just turns out nobody until now had another parser for docutils. So it doesn't have to look like restructured text. MyST generates Sphinx stuff that Sphinx doesn't realize isn't coming from restructured text. Another simple install, pip install for MyST. Then you go into your Sphinx configuration file, conf.py, and add it as an extension, MyST under parser. Et voila. When you put something ending in .md into your Sphinx doc tree, you're going to be authoring Sphinx in Markdown. For example, what I do first is I change my index.rst to index.md. And then from that point on, I just change the syntax from restructured text to Markdown and it all works. Look at what this is saying on the screen. This is pretty cool. It's evidence that you can have restructured text and Markdown side by side. With MyST, you can still keep all of your RST and just add one new Markdown file. I'm not going to talk about the role of doc strings until later. Show me, Paul, you might say. So let's show you about some basic Markdown stuff and how it just transparently works in Sphinx. So I might have, and this is from the intro, I might have a heading. I might have a paragraph, a list, an unordered list. I might have a link to an external website. And what you see here is on the left, the Markdown, on the right, a rendering in my tool of choice, which would happen to be PyCharm. And then at the bottom, that live reload thing showing me what the output looks like. I bring up this thing about the right because one of the things MyST is really working hard on is being kind of given an experience in Markdown that feels normal and right, so that if you're using Markdown tools such as this preview, then it won't just look like a big pile of non-Markdown stuff. If I want to put in an image, it's about what you would expect. You put in an image and you point at it. Now, I say it's about what you would expect. I've already gone into this cool world of MyST and Sphinx because I'm pointing at a local file and Sphinx is going to copy it to the output and possibly run it through Pillow and do some optimizations on it. More importantly, as we'll talk about later, this will all work when you generate PDF, which is kind of mind-blowing. People in Hugo and Jekyll and all those things don't expect to be able to generate PDF. This will also work for all of you who desperately want to generate man pages. Now, here's a pattern we'll see in this presentation, and you will see a lot of as you use MyST. They have kind of the normal, basic, looks familiar to Markdown people syntax. And then there's this other enhanced syntax, which kind of we'll say it bubbles up the Sphinx stuff that's underlying. And in this case, this is an enhanced Markdown image. And what it's doing is, let's go into a little bit of Sphinx theory here. Sphinx has these things called directives, roles and directives. Roles are inline, directives are blocks. And you can think of them as kind of widgets. Now, widgets are output. Directives are like input and content model that can go to multiple kinds of output like PDF. But think of it as a portlet or widget or something that you put in the middle of your Markdown. And directives can have options passed to them. And in this case, I want to put an alt. I want to do some other things. This is a way to pass extra stuff to your image instead of that just one markdown exclamation line. So that's pretty cool. You can not use the RST :key : space value syntax and use YAML, which is actually what I do because I don't have to think anymore about the syntax. I got another reason later on for why I use YAML. And so in this case, you do the directive part, you do -- like front matter, and then you do your pile of YAML and you do -- And if you're doing a directive that has a body, after that, you'll put your markdown text as the argument to that directive. All right. Now, I said basic. This isn't really that basic. We've got Sphinx underneath, and we got Sphinx underneath with this cool, accessible syntax, thanks to Markdown. And you can know not much at all and take advantage of Sphinx, or you can know a whole lot more and take advantage of Sphinx. You can know a whole lot more and write your own directives and things like that that are exposed to Markdown. And like I mentioned, you want to generate PDF in these alternate formats. Why not? And then the big enchilada, rich linking. So let's do a couple of more things that are familiar if you're in Sphinx and see what they would look like in Markdown via MyST. Admonitions, I want to put a warning. I want to put a notice. I want to put an info, all those little call out block things that Sphinx makes so easy. This is how you would do it in Markdown with MyST. It's a code fence, the triple backtick quote. Code fences or code blocks or whatever you want to call them in Markdown, I think most people call them code fences, are quite popular. It's a way to include code or something that seems a little bit like code in the middle of a Markdown document. And with MyST, what you do, and normally for like a Markdown code fence, you would put triple backtick. And then if you wanted to like pass an argument, you would immediately say JavaScript or TSX or whatever is the language of that code fence. What MyST does is it says, hey, how about this? You put something in colons, and I'm going to use the Sphinx directive for that. You're like talking to Sphinx inside that colon. And so in this case, I want the warning directive, which is an admonition in Sphinx. And so I put warning in there, and then it's Markdown right in the middle of that. And so that's a pretty cool way about that. A difference between reCommon and MyST, if you go to the website, you will see some of the points about the differences. They evaluated a number of parsers, Mistletoe, Mistune. In fact, I believe the first generation of MyST was written on, I'll get this backwards, Mistletoe. And then they decided to make their own parser. And they've got a good explanation for why they did that. All right, onward. This whole thing about code fences has an optional syntax for those who want the body of their code fence. If their body has some Markdown in it and you'd like it to be rendered, you can do this little note here, turn it on. Here's an example of it. Right in the middle of the body of my code fence, because I've changed it to colons from backticks, I can now get in my preview on the right, I can get rendered Markdown and see my italics. And so that's pretty nice. So if you are doing a code fence that has a body, not just options, and that body has Markdown in it, consider switching to this colon thing. To answer the question about reCommon, lots of things in MyST are in this direction of, I'm going to give you a basic syntax, but we're going to do this other thing that really taps into Sphinx. Regarding reCommon, I'm not going to speak for Eric, but I think Eric is ready to say, hey, y'all, just use MyST. I don't know if it's available on Read the Docs yet. Eric, I hope I got that right. Here's one more directive, which is really handy to use in Sphinx and easy to use in MyST and Markdown. Download, I've got a PDF. I want to link to it in the middle of my document. And I want that PDF copied to the build output and I want Sphinx to generate a relative link to it so I don't have to think about it. All of those things can be done with that single line. You'll see that we put something in curly braces and then a backtick. And the backtick has greater than, less than in it. That's familiar a little bit to Sphinx people. You can put the link text, and then in the greater than, less than, you put the path. Then in front, what we're doing is we're doing a signal from Markdown to Sphinx. This is the directive I want to use. I want to use download. And all these directives are documented on the Sphinx site. Wow, Paul, that's great. Car crash when we hit table of contents. Sphinx has this idea of the doc tree. And just because you put a Markdown file in a folder doesn't mean that it's going to get used. In fact, you'll get a warning from Sphinx saying, hey, you got this Markdown file over there. You didn't link it to anything, so it doesn't exist. You have to put it in a top tree, which is an ordered way to say, this, give me a link of this file, this file, this file, this file, and I will render all of those things and copy them to the output and generate relative links. So this is the minimum to do a top tree using the MyST syntax in Markdown, similar to what we saw before with some of the other ones like warning, code fence with a triple backtick, curly braces, and directive name. And then the body in this case is the name of the files that go in this top tree. Let's do some options. Top tree has its fair share of options. And so here we're passing 2 options to top tree about the depth and what kind of little heading to put on it. And like I showed before, options can be expressed in the Sphinx : thingy syntax or in YAML. So this is the exact same thing done as YAML. And we have top trees. All right, now I'm going to switch over to the section that really gets Paulie's heart beating, linking. None of these other things, Jekyll, Hugo, Gatsby, Pelican, etc. If you link to something and it doesn't exist, you're not really going to be told about that. And you will outsource that QA to your audience. Sphinx has been so cool over the years about rich ways to say, hey, link to that thing over there, where you just make a reference to it rather than a path or something. And all kinds of power about that, because Sphinx is like a knowledge base. It builds up a tree of your content and gives you rich features for working with that tree. Let's look at the basic Sphinx linking syntax as done in Markdown. I've got something in the same directory as me called page 1, and I want to link to it. And here's the link text. You'll notice that I didn't say page1.md. Because MyST and Sphinx and all of that, we'll just figure it out. You kind of express what your file extensions are in your comp file, but your plugins probably set that up for you. So that's great. You see in my output, I have a link with the link text, and it'll go to page 1. But wait, there's more. Look at this. In my square brackets, I got a whole lot of nothing. And yet, in the output, I got link text. How did that magic happen, you may say? Well, that's Sphinx. You said page 1. It knows what page 1 is because it's got a little database of all your content, and it knows the title that you specified for page 1. And so it will put the title in there. And tomorrow, when you change that title, you don't have to go find all the things that link to it and update it. It'll put the title in there. And if page 1 doesn't exist, it will warn you about it. So this is one of the, we're going to do a lot more on the Sphinx linking, but this is kind of just a small step that is still familiar to Markdown people, which when you put in the hands of people making a larger website or a knowledge base or anything like that, gets to be a lot of power. And I'll confess, this is what I'm interested in. I don't want a great 5 minutes for my first exposure to a blog tool. I'm interested in 5 years, not 5 minutes. And so I want a system which will help me and let me think about the content first and the page and rendering second. All right, Roxana, you and I are in the same tribe. Seriously. This is, if you're one of those people that's like noun verb like me, and you think of your content first and you think of your sexy pixels second, then you're in my tribe. Like I said, broken link. Here I have a markdown link. It's pointing at something that doesn't exist. Sphinx gives me a nice error message. The error message is doinked up because I'm using this live reload thing. If you just ran Sphinx from the command line, it would look really pretty. Sidebar. The world of Python and modern web could use some tooling from the front end world that really has nailed the developer experience and even authoring experience on these front end tools. Sidebar over. We just pointed at a file name. And sure, I could say .. / folder1 / subfolder 2 / page 1, but I'm still thinking in terms of file names. And I'm a man of a certain age, and I can't be bothered to remember the names of all the files on my system. Sure, my IDE will give me some autocomplete on that. Thank you, PyCharm. But just like smart IDEs are teaching us to think about symbols and not files, and navigate by symbols and not files, Sphinx thinks of symbols and not files. If you want to link to something, sure, you can link to a file, but wouldn't it be nice if you could just link to a label kind of thing? Or I want to link to that heading, 3 headings down into the document. Not only do I want to link there, I want to get the text from the heading and insert it as my link text so that when that changes, I don't have to go update everything. Sphinx does this with roles and refs. This is the documentation from the MyST site talking about it. Targets and cross-referencing, lots of goodness in MyST and the parser underneath for handling this. We see an example of what you do. You can go and put this header under target in parens just before a heading, and you've defined a label, header under target, that you can link to from anywhere, and it will generate the relative path to get there for you. You don't have to know where it is. All that stuff will be handled behind the scenes for you. And then the second part shows curly braces like we saw before with ref on the inside, which is exactly the way you would do it if you were writing restructured text. You would put like : ref : and then you can put the header target. You can also do that trick to give some link text. Let's look at it without link text. So here on the top in my editor, I link to something, and I'm linking to the welcome label that's in another document, in this case, page 1. And then on the bottom, I see page 1, and I've scrolled down to where that heading is, and you see how I defined a link. And then the text that goes with it. And then in the output, you see the header text is used as the link text. I didn't have to type it in my reference in the top part. So that's already nice. But what if the thing you're linking to doesn't really has a really long title and you just want to say something short? You can still put in link text. In the back text, you will put both some text, and in greater than, less than, you will put the role that you want to refer to. It's actually quite similar to what you would do in restructured text without that underscore thing at the end, which I can never remember if I'm supposed to put it. All right, more friendly already. I would like to point out, though, look at the lower thing in my editor where I put welcome equal. Wouldn't it be nice if I didn't have to do that? Wouldn't it be nice if there was a tool which would just make role names out of the text that you used? And you wouldn't have to think about it. Don't make me think. There is a way to do this, auto-generating header anchors from the text, and then auto-generating the roles that go with it. Pretty handy. It may be one of those conveniences that proves inconvenient. If your link text isn't stable and changes a lot, then you will break some of your references. Of course, Sphinx will tell you that you broke a reference. Justin, your point about the 5-minute versus 5-year, I'm with you on that. My goodness. I got bigger things I want to do than put up my dog pictures. Love my dog. I got more to say than that. Here's a big one. I've talked about some things that the Hugos of the world don't really try to do, like generate PDF and tell you when you point at something that's broken and generate link text for you. This, my friends, is the mothership of you're doing what? Imagine you have like a multi-site network of content. We'll call it the Python ecosystem. And let's say that you have an easy way to share all this documentation and content. We'll call that, I don't know, read the docs. And it's really easy to go and fire up your browser and go find documentation written in the same tool. I'm writing documentation. And I want to write documentation that says, hey, this Sphinx role thing is pretty cool. Oh my God, I've got to stop, go find the URL. What if the URL changes? Paste it back over here, blah, blah, blah. Enter Sphinx lets you link to symbols remotely as if they were locally. And all you have to do, as shown here, is add this extension and then go map some of the sites that you want to link to. And what happens is, this example might be a little longer than I wanted to. This is an example. Yeah. This is an example that goes and gets information about Sphinx roles, and it combines all of these ideas into one. Enter Sphinx, this concept of Sphinx called domains, where you can organize your taxonomy and your symbols and your concepts into something called Python, or into something called Sphinx, or into something called RST or NumPy or something like that. And I can point directly to that role using a path to get there. And when I build my docs, Sphinx will go to the site that I mapped, here, the URL that I used. It will get a file called objects.inv from there, and it will go look that up, just as if that role was locally. Very interesting to use. You can do a much shorter syntax for that. Now, admit it, that's pretty nice. The text that goes in is the text that is managed and defined by the author of the thing I'm linking to. And if they rearrange their path and put those docs somewhere else, my site will keep working because I'm using symbols. I'm not using paths. All right. So I'm going to do a little intermission here, and I'm going to cheat a little bit, look over at the Slack channel, see some of the concepts or some of the comments that people might be saying. I'm going to make the sales pitch for you. What would it take for you to start using Sphinx? What might have been holding you back for using Sphinx? And I don't mean for docs. I mean for websites, things that people don't actually think of as docs. Is it Markdown that's been holding you back because restructured text ain't your jam? Is it because things are kind of ugly? Or some of these other points? Give some of your feedback about I'm curious about Sphinx, but I'm not going to do it because of this. Yes, thank you, Calvin, for putting that over there. Okay, on to code snippets. I said I'm writing a site. I'm not doing docs. Guess what? Nearly everything that I want to say on my site is about code. So I want some cool ways to get code into websites without having to do what I'm doing here, which is screenshotting. You can do code snippets in Sphinx, in MyST, in Markdown, using something that's very familiar to Markdown people, which is code fences. We already talked about it. The trillions of people worldwide know everything about code snippets and code fences. It looks familiar to them. Triple backtick, put in some code. By default, you'll get the Python language when you're rendering in Sphinx. So you see at the bottom, it's syntax highlighted for Python, actually Python 3. So if you don't specify a language, Sphinx is going to think that you're using Python 3. But PyCharm needs to be told what language it is so it will render correctly. So I'll go ahead and be explicit is better than implicit. I'll put Python in there. And now my tooling for Markdown and my generator Sphinx are on the same page with what to make it look like. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have other languages. Let's use JavaScript. Same thing. It renders and highlights nicely on the right in my tooling, renders and highlights nicely in Sphinx at the bottom. All is good. I just provided a very Markdown familiar thing called the language for it. But Paul, can you do more? You talked earlier about directives and options. Can I do that with code fences? Why, yes, you can. Sphinx has some pretty cool stuff in storytelling about code. And I'm gradually building something up. I don't want them to have to reread 30 lines and see what changed. I want to highlight the change. And so I can pass this argument called emphasize lines. I can do it with normal kind of restructured text options, or I can use that YAML thing. So here I've combined a code fence in Markdown and a directive saying code block and passing an argument to it saying the language. And then I've done some options to say what to emphasize. Now, this means, though, that you got to cut and paste the code into your Markdown. Well, you know what? Paul doesn't write his projects in Markdown. Paul writes his projects in Python files. Sphinx makes it dead simple to literally include a file of code into the moral equivalent of a code block. And then it's got most of the same kinds of options, tons and tons and tons and tons of options. So for example, I want to include Hello Underworld. I do that. Not that hard. And you see what I get for a whole bunch of convenience generated into the output. Calvin, that's a good point about real-time editing and make docs. That universe is extremely helpful for authors. Now, I can also do literal include with some options, as we see here. And in this case, I'm doing the emphasize lines thing again. Literal include has some really cool options, because what if I add an extra line? You know, and so my lines might be off. Well, you can put these markers in that say start here, finish there, and not show the entire file. Then the granddaddy of them all, Autodoc. Most would say this is the heart of Sphinx. Pointing Sphinx at your code and having it just walk through everything and generate essentially API docs. Extremely powerful, a big ecosystem of add-ons, lots of fun to work with. Here is the Sphinx page, or maybe it's the read the docs page. I think it's the read the docs page about Autodoc. What do you got to do to get Autodoc? It's already bundled, so you just have to include it as an extension. But you have to make sure the thing that you're pointing it at, the kind of package path, module path, is available to your current Python virtual environment or whatever. And if you're working in a package, setup.py, PyProject.toml, that's already there. But if not, you got to do this syspath insert dance. And at that point, the current directory is part of the path, and I can point at hello world.py. How would I do that? I would, in the middle of some place where I got the narrative, and I want to say, now, here's the API docs. I'm going to do a directive. However, this one's a little bit of a dance because Miss hasn't really made this enhanced Markdown syntax for Autodoc. So what they do is give you a kind of escape portal to evaluate restructured text in the middle of a code fence. And so I'm going to do the auto class directive. I'm going to point it at a class, and I'm going to pass it some options. And you see the output at the bottom, and even has like linkable stuff to Python things and other parts of your code. Now, here's something that's really dang cool. It does more than just render a pretty output. Those symbols in your code become refs, roles, I should say, that you can refer to. So in some other file like I have here, I'm going to point at that class and link to that class. And it will generate a relative link and land me on that section in the Markdown file. We can go a little bit further with this extended Markdown syntax and express our linking instead of this way, using in Markdownish way, using this way, which is more of a MyST way. It actually gives you access to a little bit more features. As an example of getting a little more power out of it, let's say I've got a function with a doc string, and it's got, this is the Google doc string format. And using Napoleon, which is an extension for AutoDoc, I can get that rendered correctly. I also use an AutoDoc extension for type hints because, yeah, I'm one of those type hint people. Sorry. Now let's get on to some advanced stuff that we can do with MyST, the kind of open your mind, think bigger about what you might want out of a simple little blog generator. And I'll start with the dumbest thing in the world, comments. But for whatever reason, this is like a controversial thing in some systems. If you have some content in your Markdown that you don't want in the output yet, you can put a comment on it. It will not be generated, will not go to HTML, will not go to PDF, etc. This is probably the part of my presentation where my heart goes aflutter. Because again, I don't think in terms of pixels, I think in terms of structure. In your docs, I mean, Sphinx has supported this. You can put stuff at the top of your document and it will be parsed into this structure called doc info. It's not really that common. But MyST really exposes this. You can do what looks like Jekyll YAML. If you've used Jekyll, if you use Hugo, if you use anything else out there, you know that their Markdown files have dash, 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 YAML, dash, 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 and then those values are available in your templates, in your system. And when I look at a pile of Sphinx documents, and especially with this in Markdown, I think of it as a database of Markdown that happens to be on the file system instead of SQLite or Postgres, but it's a hierarchical database with content documents that have structure in them that I actually, God bless me, do content types that I parse into Pydantic and do validation, match to views, and yeah, unreconstructed CMS person. This one is freaky in the extreme. If you've got little things that you use over and over in your content, you can define them in your conf.py. You can define them even in a single document and then refer to them easily over and over in the rest of your content. These things that you put in can actually be Markdown MyST things. They can actually be like Jinja 2 expression-y kinds of things. Where the inputs are based on other input. And so you can see the before and after on the left. This is some Markdown that taps into these substitutions that I defined. And so what does it look like when it's rendered? Look on the right, you'll see the rendered output. You can also, if you've got reusable snippets, you can also reuse content by just doing an include. And you see a couple of examples on here. Look at that one on the bottom. That's just badass. Way to go, MyST, you smart people. If I'm sitting in the world of Markdown, I can still tap into the world of restructured text with 1,000 documents that I don't have time to convert. Yay, thanks. And then I talked about this I don't know how many people care about making a PDF version of their knowledge base. I do. I go on planes a lot. And Sphinx has long allowed you to generate PDF, but you got to go through this kind of LaTeX step. There's this other thing called Rhinotype. I've dabbled with it a little bit. I don't know if it's got some warts and sharp edges, but it was simple. And the output it generated was semantically rich. So interesting. Okay. On to everyone's favorite part of a presentation, the end. Especially for my presentations, because there's really not a lot of content in them. It's just a lot of performance art. I'm going to wax lyrical a little bit about my undying love for Sphinx. Not just what it can do, but decades of maintenance and bug fixes. You go to their change log, their release notes, and it's like acres, hectares, not the metrification of that. Tons, big units of bug fixes and little tiny tweaks and little conveniences things, and occasionally a big feature. And those people, my goodness, how do you do that year after year after year? Maintain an open source project, keep things fixed. Don't go do revolutionary stuff or go fork it and go do something else. Kudos to them. Really an important part of the value proposition of the Python ecosystem. Then layer on top of that, Eric, and read the docs. And now ethical ads, which is part of the read the docs pitch and ecosystem. So yay for Sphinx, yay for read the docs, yay for ethical ads. On the topic of this talk specifically, I hereby declare Markdown as the official input language for Sphinx. Change my mind. Should have used that meme. I think it is mature enough. It's featureful enough. It gives you an escape hatch if it doesn't do something right. To get back into the restructured text, you can have them side by side. And just like last month, I forgot to go look at their release notes. And Chris added something to a release last month. And I was like, damn, I didn't even know I needed that. That's brilliant. And their project is really engaging on how they answer bugs and give feedback and take input. A lot of vitality in MyST. So I highly recommend taking a look at it. And I would like all of us to take a step back. I've got a stand-up desk. Take a step back and change our minds a little bit about what we think about Sphinx. It's great at docs, but it could be so much more. If you are a noun person like me, think about using Sphinx for other things, especially if we can come up with some super sexy, compelling, modern web kinds of themes for it. Now, alternatively, we could just say, leave Sphinx alone. It doesn't need to be dragged into this crazy modern web universe where new frameworks come and die every 6 months. Let us just focus on docs. Open question. I'd be interested in some talks about that. Berna, I know it's currently in restructured text, but that's what we're here for, right? Maybe it'll change. And in kind of closing on that last point, self-promotion, I'm going to be doing a bunch of stuff on this topic in April. I know that you're not supposed to give a promise that I'm most likely to leave you unfulfilled on, but I have to because I had a PyCon talk accepted on this topic. So I've got a 50% done tutorial that will have text and code samples and videos that go with it. And we'll be rolling it out in the month of April. So if this topic is interesting to you, keep an eye on it. Let's all talk about it. Thank you, 6 Feet Up. Thank you, Python Web Conference. Thank you all for listening. And come and see us at the Quiz Bowl. And come and hear about Python 1994 on Friday.